Welcome to Crimes in the Dark, the channel where the most chilling crimes come to life in the dark. Before sleep catches up with you, subscribe, and tell me where you're listening to this story from. Now turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let yourself go, because what you are about to hear is real. Case 1. Bloomridge was the kind of town that didn't make the news. Small, slow, shrouded in mild winters and long springs, where the trees looked older than the houses, where the window curtains were always closed at the same time, and neighbors greeted each other without stopping. To the naked eye, everything in Bloomridge seemed orderly, familiar, harmless. The streets were straight and narrow, lined with street lamps that tinkled on windy nights. The facades, made of old brick, retained an aesthetic that had not changed since the 1970s. Years ago, Bloomridge had been a transient town. Now it seemed like a city at a standstill, like a forgotten postcard in a drawer. No one expected anything truly dark to happen there. And yet, it did. The alarm was not raised by blood, nor the screams. It was the silence, a kind of silence that is felt before something terrible happens. The silence that precedes a storm that is no longer in the sky, but on earth. Ava Bradford was the first, found dead in her apartment, sitting upright in a chair as if waiting for someone who never came. The air was heavy with stale perfume. She wore dark glasses, her hair dyed golden blonde, and a lavender satin dress straight out of another era. Around her neck, like an unspeakable message, hung a thick braid, woven from the locks of different women. When her glasses were removed, her eyes were not there. Two dark, clean cavities, a surgery of horror. It wasn't long before another scene appeared. Joyce McAllister. Same hairstyle, same dress, same background music. She was found paralyzed, probably alive for much of the process. They threw ammonia in her eyes. She was made up. She was dressed. Her body still showed signs of life when the transformation began. And when it was over, they left her there, like an incomplete replica, a failed mold, an echo of someone else. The third was Paula Patterson. She had shown signs. She had been attacked in public weeks before. A precise, direct haircut, as if someone had marked her fate with a single scissors. No one intervened. No one understood. Then came the 911 call, shaky, barely audible. When the police arrived, Paula was no longer alive. They found her in the bathroom, slashed, shower water still running. The killer had fled seconds before. 3 women, no apparent relationship. 3 deaths marked by the same visual language. The hair, the clothes, the eyes. All transformed into figures from another era. Not killed with rage, but with precision. As if each crime were an attempt at recovery, an obsessive reconstruction. The case fell into the hands of Detective Malcolm Rourke, a man who over the years had learned to read silence as well as evidence. 52 years old, straight back, dry face, and gray eyes that seemed always absent, as if searching for a clue in the invisible. Rourke had seen many things, but not like this. This wasn't about killing. It was about converting, about modeling, as if the killer was imitating someone lost, or someone who never existed. As the bodies were examined, Rourke walked through the scenes with the precision of a watchmaker. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. He knew the killer wasn't finished, that this was all just the first act, and that somewhere in Bloomridge, someone else was already being targeted. Malcolm Rourke did not believe in coincidences, nor in reports that spoke only of the manner of death. To understand a crime, he said, you have to understand the interrupted life, the absences it leaves behind, and above all, the details that no one asks about. While the city was still holding its breath after the discovery of the third body, Rourke sat in front of a whiteboard in the department's small analysis room. There were no formulas or maps, just 3 names, 3 photographs printed on plain paper. Ava Bradford, Joyce McAllister, Paula Patterson. Ava was the first. Her name barely appeared in the report. No occupation recorded, no next of kin, no one to claim her immediately. Rourke sat in her apartment for hours. He wasn't looking for prints. He was looking for traces of life. In the closet, he found drab-colored clothes, papers in disarray, unfinished paints. There were brushes in the laundry room, but they had been dry for months. On her bedside table, a diary with unwritten dates. Only on the last page, a note in loose, shaky handwriting, "I am not her." Rourke knew that the killer hadn't just killed her. He had remade her, turned her into something else. a figure molded from a distant image. Ava received a haircut on the street weeks before she died. No one helped her. She didn't scream. She just walked away as if she knew it was too late. She was found with her eyes removed, her hair dyed, and a thick braid tied around her throat. In her blood, an overdose of morphine. She died without a fight, in silence, as if she had agreed to disappear. Joyce McAllister was different. She was 38 years old, a retired teacher. She lived alone but was known in the neighborhood for taking care of stray cats. Rourke talked to the niece who visited her every Saturday. She said that lately she noticed her strange, as if someone was watching her. In her house, everything was clean, too clean. There were no open books, no used cups, no clothes out of place. Just a mirror covered with a sheet and a box of half-burned photographs on the mantelpiece. The scene of her death was even more cruel. Joyce was paralyzed with chemicals, blinded with ammonia, and made up while she was still alive. Her body showed signs of internal distress but no external movement. There was vomit next to her cheek. She died unable to move, without being able to scream. The killer did not need to hide. He did not run away. He took his time. He dressed her in an antique dress identical to Eva's. He combed her hair with care. He didn't take his eyes off her. This time he left them, as if they were not necessary, as if the resemblance lay elsewhere. The third victim was Paula Patterson. She was 29 years old. She worked in a small gallery downtown. She was outgoing with friends with a routine. She was the only one who fought back, the only one who screamed. Rourke checked the cameras at a nearby store. He saw the moment. A stranger approached her. He cut a lock of her hair. It was a quick move, rehearsed. Paula pushed him away. She looked around. No one helped her. No one got involved. Hours later, she made a 911 call. Her voice was shaking. She said someone was following her, that he was going to turn her. The police arrived 9 minutes later. Paula was already dead. In the bathroom, slashed with a fine tool. The shower water was still running. There was no time for more. In her bedroom, Rourke found a box of old magazine clippings. Images of actresses, of 70s fashion, of women with similar faces, some marked with red pencil. One of the figures had her eyes gouged out with scissors. The circle was beginning to close. But there was more. 11 women reported that someone cut their hair in public in recent weeks. None saw the face clearly. None could identify the aggressor, just a shared feeling, coldness, swiftness, silence. In the laboratory, analysis of the braid found on Eva's neck revealed that it was composed of hair from at least 26 women. Many of them never reported the crime, or perhaps they did not do it in time. For Rourke, it wasn't just about murder. It was about reconstruction of a figure that the killer could not let go. Each victim was an incomplete replica, a failed attempt, one step closer to something or someone. The pattern was clear, but the why was still a distant echo. And that was what worried him the most. When they began to draw the lines between the victims, at first everything seemed disconnected. Ava Bradford was reserved, Joyce McAllister, a retired former teacher, Paula Patterson, young, outgoing, and creative. All three lived in different areas, shared no social circles, no work environments. There were no common medical records, no family ties. But when Rourke asked to review the database of complaints related to harassment or non-consensual physical contact, focusing especially on cases of public haircuts, a name kept coming up, barely noticeable, like a shadow in the background of a photograph. Jeffrey Wright. His name appeared in a complaint that was never prosecuted. A woman claimed that during a styling consultation at his studio, Wright had insisted on giving her a cut, inspired by another era. When she refused, he grabbed her by the arms, cut off a lock of her hair with surgical precision, and told her that he was helping her regain what she had lost. The woman fled, she never returned, and a formal case was never opened, until now. Wright was 56 years old. He was known in Bloomridge for his small hairdressing studio on the east side of town. He had a reputation for being eccentric, meticulous, obsessed with hair as a symbol of identity. He had worked years before in aesthetic programs for women with cancer, helping them cope with their hair loss with custom wigs, extensions, and self-esteem sessions. For a time, he was admired. He was even featured in a local article for his work with oncology patients. But then something changed. His business became less professional, more private. The place once entered by appointment now looked closed from the outside. The sign remained, But the light on the sign never came back on. Rourke requested a search of the studio. What they found there was not what they expected. There were braids, dozens of them. Some hung like trophies, others carefully stored in cardboard boxes. They were labeled with names of women who did not appear in any police system. Vintage dresses hung on racks, arranged by color, texture, and size. Satin dresses, lace dresses, fabrics that hadn't been made in decades. In a corner, a small room adapted with soft lights, a round mirror, and a chair identical to the one found in Eva's apartment. On a work table, makeup products, surgical scissors, and photographs cut out of old magazines. All of them of blonde women with the same type of hairstyle. The most disturbing thing was not the content. It was the order. Everything was arranged with obsessive precision, as if each element had its assigned place in a silent choreography. Nothing was improvised, nothing was random. The hair found there, however, did not match that of the victims. Each sample was analyzed. None corresponded to Eva, Joyce, or Paula. That difference, far from alleviating, set Rourke's alarm bells ringing even louder. During the interrogation, Wright was calm. His voice measured, his gestures controlled. He did not deny the cuts. He did not deny his obsession, but he defended himself by arguing that his work was aesthetic, emotional, even restorative. He claimed that women did not understand what he was offering. He said he was only trying to restore them to their best version, as if female identity was an aesthetic form that he had a responsibility to protect. When asked about Eva, his gaze wandered for just a moment. Then he said he had met her years ago, when she was still attending a support group for women with self-image issues. Wright offered symbolic cuts there, self-renewals, as she called them. Eva was special, she said. Quiet, sad, but with something ancient in her eyes. He couldn't remember the exact date, but he recognized having seen her recently. Maybe in the street, maybe in a gallery. He didn't want to specify more. About Joyce McAllister, he denied ever meeting her. But on his desk, among the business papers, was a file with her full name. Dated 5 years earlier. A handwritten note read, "Soft eyes, symmetrical face, contained beauty." When it was shown to him, Wright didn't respond. He just blinked. Once. Rourke began to spin. Wright wasn't just a stylist with old-fashioned ideas. He was someone who believed he had the power or the duty to rebuild, to correct. He had developed an obsession with a specific figure, an idealized woman, not a modern archetype, but an image anchored in the past, someone who perhaps existed or whom he imagined so intensely that he ended up believing he could find her again. Again and again. The most disturbing piece of information came later. Among the objects found in his studio was a sealed box with carved initials, CH. Inside there were old photographs, torn letters, and a blonde wig with dark roots. Everything pointed to a woman from Wright's past, perhaps the genesis of his fixation. It was not yet known who she was, but the dates written on the envelopes matched the year Wright began working with oncology patients, a possible emotional trigger. What disturbed Rourke most was the quiet certainty with which Wright described his vision of beauty, as if the pain of others was only a minor consequence of the creative process, as if the victims were materials for a larger work, an impossible restoration, a lost image, a constant imitation. Wright was held. The prosecution had insufficient evidence to charge him with the murders, but the psychological report recommended intensive surveillance. Rourke knew they were close, but it wasn't enough. The killer had left too many loose pieces, too many failed fakes, and if Wright wasn't the perpetrator, then who was still looking for that face, that unattainable figure? And above all, who would be next? As the case took shape, Detective Malcolm Rourke realized that the killer not only sought to replicate an image, but to control the entire process surrounding it. From the initial cut to the last breath, everything was choreographed with morbid finesse. There was no anger, no rush, just a desire for transformation. And in that pattern, control over the body, pain, and consciousness played a pivotal role. It was then that Rourke began to look away, toward the hospitals. Among the medical records cross-referenced with the names of the victims, one name appeared with more matches than could be easily explained. Dr. Mark Harris, a specialist in palliative oncology. He worked at St. Emilion Medical Center, a private hospital outside Bloomridge. His main role consisted of accompanying terminally ill patients in their last days, administering pain management, and supporting families during the process of saying goodbye. He was 48 years old, had an impeccable career and a reputation for clinical empathy that had made him a respected figure in his environment. But in reviewing his schedules and patient records, Rourke noticed something disturbing. In the last year, Harris had cared, albeit briefly, for two people very close to the victims. Eva Bradford's mother had been treated at that hospital months before she died, and Joyce McAllister had participated in a psychological care program for cancer survivors at the same facility. Both links seemed tenuous, but they were too specific to ignore. The break came with an anonymous phone call. A distorted voice, who would not give his name, mentioned that Harris collected mementos from his patients, that he had a locked room in his home, and that she spoke of death as a woman's purest moment. With that information, Rourke obtained a search warrant. What they found was no ordinary killer's room. It was a clinical space, quiet, clean, but deeply disturbing. There were samples of human hair arranged in numbered vials, mostly blonde in different shades, some with labels, others with no identification. Cross-referenced with forensic analysis of the crimes, several locks matched those of Eva and Joyce. The hair was chemically treated, straightened, and uniformly cut. It was not incidental. It was not for medical analysis. It was a collection. On a low shelf hidden behind a linen curtain was a wooden box with a double bottom. Inside, an old photograph, blurry, in black and white, a young woman sitting in a chair with her hands on her knees. She was looking straight at the camera. The hairstyle, the makeup, the dress were identical to those of the victims. The expression, serene, slight, as if she knew that this moment would last forever. On the back of the photograph, just one word written in pencil: Clara. Rourke took the image to the lab. The paper was from the 1970s, authentic. The style of clothing matched the dresses found at the crime scenes. The woman bore an obvious resemblance to Eva, Joyce, and Paula. Not identical, but enough to mark an obsession. She wasn't just any female figure. She was a specific one. A lost face that someone was trying to replicate, with live victims one by one. In reviewing Dr. Harris's medical history, an even more disturbing fact emerged. His mother, Clara Harris, died in 1992 after an advanced oncologic illness. It was he who cared for her at home during her final days, and according to the official record, it was he who administered the final dose of morphine, legally approved, clinically allowed. But the report indicated a slightly higher amount than recommended, nothing that provoked suspicion at the time. But now that excess seemed more like a planned farewell than a medical decision. During the interrogation, the doctor showed no signs of stress. His composure was that of a man accustomed to talking about death, calmly, with technicality. When asked about the hair found in his home, he said it was part of a personal clinical study, focusing on the effects of cancer treatment on hair texture. There were no permits, no publications, but the argument was plausible, or at least difficult to refute without further evidence. Regarding the photograph, he limited himself to saying that it was an image of his mother, that he kept it as a souvenir, and that the coincidences with the victims were circumstantial. He said that many women resembled each other when they adopted the style of the 70s, that there was no obsession, just nostalgia. Rourke was not convinced. There was something in the doctor's gaze, a glint that didn't match his controlled tone, as if every answer was rehearsed, as if he had already thought of that possibility long before anyone asked it. But the most chilling thing was what he did not say. He never denied knowing the victims. He never said he had not seen them. He only said he didn't remember accurately, that he had seen many faces, many women, many goodbyes. Despite the findings, there was insufficient evidence to hold him. But Harris was flagged in the report as a person of primary interest. His behavior, his environment, his family history, and the photograph that directly connected to the aesthetics imposed on the crimes made him a dangerous candidate. Rourke called for continued surveillance. He was not interested in falsely catching him. He wanted to do it with certainty, because for him there was no doubt. In the killer's mind, it was all part of a ritual of replication. A woman who died too soon. An image that was never seen again, and a twisted, obsessive, progressive attempt to remake her, over and over again. And if Harris was the one guiding the hands behind that reconstruction, a crucial question remained. Who did you need to look like? Every time Rourke felt he was approaching a definite shape, it changed, like a figure seen through water, blurry, shifting, unstable. The pattern was clear, but the perpetrator was fading between pieces that fit together too well, or too soon. And just when the traces of Dr. Harris were still fresh, another name appeared. One that did not belong to the clinical world. It belonged to the world of imaging, aesthetics, representation. Elias Thompson, known as Eli, was a freelance photographer specializing in vintage fashion. He had a small studio in the old Bloomridge area. On his social media, he showed stylized portraits of women in clothes from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. Black and white images, serene faces, empty or dreamy gazes. She was part of a local artistic community, but kept to the margins. He never sought mass attention. His models were almost always the same. Some well-known, some anonymous. But one in particular caught Rourke's eye. Paula Patterson. The young woman had appeared in at least 5 sessions signed by Eli, some on location, others in his studio. In all of them, Paula appeared with hairstyles similar to those that the killer later replicated. Clothes adjusted to the 70s aesthetic, neutral looks. In some images, Eli portrayed her from behind. In others, he digitally intervened her features, subtly modifying the shape of her face, eyes, or hairstyle, as if trying to bring her closer to a figure that was not her. Paula's file at the police station had already recorded a disturbing precedent. A harassment complaint filed against Eli a year earlier. Paula accused him of obsessive behavior. She said he wouldn't accept that their relationship was over, that he followed her, that he sent her modified images of himself with phrases like, "This is what you really look like." The complaint was unsuccessful. There was no conclusive evidence, but it was registered. And now Rourke had reason to dust it off. Upon inspecting Eli's studio, detectives found a windowless back room where photographs were developed in the traditional manner. Among the chemicals and trays of hanging images was a black box. Inside, various personal items, old movie tickets, an embroidered handkerchief, a broken bracelet, and carefully wrapped in tissue paper, a lock of human hair, unlabeled, unidentified, but clearly preserved with an intention unrelated to the photograph. On the wall, hung in perfect order, were garments identical to those found at the crime scenes. Satin dresses, floral prints, blouses with shoulder pads, high-waisted skirts. They all replicated the 70s style. Some had dust or makeup stains. Others had name tags. Among them, one said Joyce, another Clara. Rourke analyzed the digital contents of Eli's computer. He found folders with hundreds of photographs, most of them archival. But one section in particular caught his eye. Restorations. In it, images of different women digitally intervened to resemble each other. Same hairstyle, same expression, same style. Even the skin tones had been modified to match, as if Eli was polishing over and over again a figure he was chasing from the image, but couldn't find in reality. When questioned, Eli admitted his relationship with Paula. He said it was intense but brief, that they separated because they had different visions of art, that his images were aesthetic explorations. He never denied that he loved her, but he spoke of her in the present tense, as if she was still part of something bigger, as if she were still alive in his work. About the dresses, she said she used them for her models, that she found them in second-hand markets, that this fashion represented a lost purity, a slower time, more authentic. When asked about the lock of hair, he hesitated. He said it belonged to an anonymous model, that she used it as a reference for color editing. He offered no further details. His alibi for the dates of the murders was ambiguous. He claimed to have left town for a photography project in another location. But his GPS records were inconsistent. There were no travel tickets, no receipt for lodging, and his phone data placed him in the vicinity of Bloomridge during the key days. Legally, nothing directly incriminated him. There was no DNA at the scenes. There were no witnesses to place him with the victims at critical moments. But the whole of his environment, his aesthetic obsession, and the digital manipulation of the faces placed him as a serious suspect, or at least as a possible copycat, a collaborator, someone who sought in his images what someone else executed with his hands. Rourke began to consider the possibility that this was not a lone killer, but a more subtle circuit, more twisted, where obsessions fed off each other without the need for direct contact, where ideas floated between artists, doctors, hairdressers, each unknowingly contributing to the same ritual, to the same figure. In his report, Eli was classified as active surveillance. There were no charges, but neither was there innocence. He was a piece that still didn't quite fit, but whose shape dangerously matched the mold the killer was using. And as Rourke looked at the intervened photographs, one particularly caught his eye. It was Paula, but not quite. Her eyes were bigger, the face more angular, the hair lighter, and in the bottom corner, almost imperceptible, a date. 1979, an era, a style. A memory turned into an obsession, and maybe, in the next crime. The answers came late, as they do in cases where the truth is buried under layers of obsession. When the circle finally closed around Dr. Mark Harris, the air in Bloomridge grew thicker, sadder, not from relief but from the realization of what had really happened. Harris was arrested after a final round of searches of his home, where irrefutable items were found. Among them a handwritten notebook, hidden inside a false compartment in his desk. There, in precise and methodical handwriting, the doctor had detailed each of the transformations. Names, dates, doses, procedures. It was a surgical log of death, written with medical coldness, but pierced by a deeply emotional language. Each entry ended with a name. Clara. Clara was not an abstract muse. Clara Harris had been his mother, his first impossible love, his first loss. A woman who, according to hospital records, had been cared for by him during the last months of his terminal illness. What the papers didn't say, but the notebook did, was that Harris had not only accompanied her, he had preserved her. He had photographed her, drawn her, studied her, as if he feared her image would fade with death, or as if he knew he could not live without seeing her again. And so it all began, with a woman who represented perfection in his eyes, a figure of serenity, beauty, and control. A mother always dressed in classic style, combed with precision, made up even in days of pain. When she died, she left a void, and Harris, with a mind trained to control body and time, decided to fill that void with science and obsession. The investigation showed that the doctor carefully selected his victims, women with features similar to Clara's, women who, with the right adjustments, could become mirrors. He approached them through medical connections, emotional support programs, or even social networks. And when I couldn't reach them directly, I watched, I waited, and I acted. The process was meticulous. First, the haircut, a symbolic gesture, a public act that marked the beginning of the transformation. Then came the selection of the dress, the aesthetic preparation. She dyed the hair, applied makeup, and used sedatives to immobilize the victims without causing chaos. In some cases, she administered morphine not just to calm, but to erase the woman's real self, and turn her slowly into Clara. The victims were molded like living sculptures, and once the desired shape was achieved, came the final silence. Death was only the last step of a much older process, more intimate. The killer did not kill for pleasure. He killed for perfection. In his notebook, Harris jotted down aesthetic observations, comments on facial symmetry, on skin tone, on how the light touched certain cheeks. He described the ideal position of the hands, the curve of the neck, the exact pallor of the rouge. And on the last page, he drew a face, not unlike Eva or Joyce or Paula, but more defined, more finished, clearer. The evidence was conclusive. The hair found in his house matched the victims. The morphine in the bodies, too. The pattern of behavior, the medical tools, the clothing, the photographs. Every piece fit, even the ones that weren't designed to. Jeffrey Wright was released days later. Although his studies still smacked of emotional illness, justice found no direct evidence linking him to the crimes. But his professional life was destroyed. His clients never returned. His name was forever linked to horror. Rourke didn't feel pity. He felt something else, a deeper unease. Wright, though he did not kill, played with the same obsession, that of remaking what was lost. Elias Eli Thompson remained under surveillance. His photograph showed a similar pattern. Women transformed to look like someone else, digitally manipulated, unknowingly dressed as Clara. Although the police failed to prove his direct involvement, Rourke did not rule out that Eli had been a witness, an emotional accomplice, or simply a copycat. What Harris did with needles and chemicals, Eli did with lights and filters. Two obsessions, one in the same image. In court, Harris did not cry. He did not deny. He did not explain. He sat quietly as if the world around him was no longer relevant, as if in his mind he had already finished his work. He was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The verdict was read in a low voice. Almost everyone present remained silent, even the victims' families. For what Harris had destroyed could not be repaired with justice. It could only be understood and feared. Bloomridge slowly returned to his routine, but nothing was the same anymore. Barbershops stopped offering walk-in cuts. Women stopped walking alone on certain streets, and every time a woman stopped in front of the mirror to adjust her hair, a shadow would run across her back. Rourke filed the case with a final note. I didn't kill out of hatred. He killed to remember. And that makes him even more dangerous. He never saw Clara's photograph again, but he carried it with him, not on paper, but in the way he now looked at people, always looking to see if someone, somewhere, was also trying to see someone again, who was already gone. Case 2. The city of Arden Heights used to be the kind of place where life didn't speed up. With well-maintained parks, old-fashioned streetlights, and brick houses under century-old trees, it seemed immune to the shocks of the outside world. But small towns have something in common with museums. When something moves inside them, everyone notices. The first death was not recognized as such at first. A woman appeared leaning against a lamppost in the Central Park. She wore a gray coat, gloves, and held a cell phone to her ear. She seemed to be concentrating, as if she was listening to someone on the other side. But she didn't move. She didn't even blink. And when a child approached to ask her the time, her body fell to the side uncontrollably, lifeless. Her name was Lena Hartley. She was 36 years old, administrative secretary, mother of a teenager, a meticulous woman, always punctual, discreet. Autopsy revealed sedation with a hospital-grade compound, followed by carbon monoxide poisoning. There were no signs of a struggle, no physical trauma. The body was dressed and positioned post-mortem with eerie precision. The nails were freshly painted. The clothes were ironed. Traces of black paint were found on the shoes and burlap fibers on the inside of the coat. The city reacted with bewilderment. There was talk of a strange, isolated case, a crime without context. No one called him a murderer yet. 17 days passed. One rainy morning, janitors found another body, this time at the bus stop in front of the municipal library, sitting cross-legged, reading a rain-dampened newspaper. He seemed to be waiting patiently. He wore a brown beret, glasses, a briefcase propped to one side. No one noticed the shortness of breath. No one wondered why he didn't turn the page. His name was Dean Weber, 64 years old, retired, lived alone. He had been a bookseller all his life. In the neighborhood, he was known for attending all the community council meetings, for donating books to children, for walking every day at the same time. He had also recently been diagnosed with early lymphoma. He lived with resignation and calm. He was a man without enemies. The forensic report was identical to the previous one. Full sedation, carbon monoxide exposure, and a carefully orchestrated scene. This time, white paint pigments were found under the fingernails, and traces of adhesive tape were found on the skin of the ankles. The press began to make connections. Arden Heights was now making national headlines. The artist of the dead, headlined some. Human statues, crime or message, asked others. And then 24 more days passed. The third body appeared at dawn, on a busy corner of the financial district, leaning against a lamppost, briefcase in hand, and an impeccable suit. Tie barely tilted as if the wind had moved it. A coffee cup balanced on the edge of a nearby dumpster completed the image. An ordinary executive waiting for a regular cab. Only he wasn't breathing. Simone Adler, 47 years old, insurance executive, divorced, no children, last seen leaving a shopping mall. She had no record, no enemies, no connections to the other victims. But her death repeated the exact pattern. Sedation, poisoning, light makeup, precise hairstyling and placement. The paint on her heels was cobalt blue, the same one that would be used on an abandoned art installation in the city's cultural center 5 years ago. It was then that the obvious was accepted. This was not random. It was not revenge. It was design. Detective Julian Mercer, assigned to the case since the first find, had been quietly following the pattern. A former art restorer turned investigator after a family tragedy, Mercer saw what others overlooked. To him, the deaths were not acts of rage or even insanity. They were compositions. Every pose, every object, every visual fragment had a purpose. Mercer began to draw a new map, not of streets. What did a woman talking on the phone, a man reading the newspaper, and an executive waiting for transportation have in common? Nothing at first glance, but they all represented common public moments, everyday actions, behaviors that are seen, and forgotten. The killer was not killing them for who they were. He killed them for what they represented. And if Mercer was right, the killer wasn't looking for victims. He was looking for scenes, fragments of urban life. Trivial moments stopped forever, as if with each body he was freezing a second that no one had valued. And in that case, the possibilities were endless. What began as an isolated case soon became a sequence, a pattern, a signature. The killer did not hide in the shadows. He placed his works in full light. In squares, bus stops, busy sidewalks. Each scene was different, but each scene had something in common. It seemed alive, until someone noticed the silence. 10 days after the third victim, another figure appeared on the south side of the business district. A woman in her 30s, leaning against a graffiti-covered brick wall, as if waiting for someone. She wore a nurse's uniform, but also carried a bag with paintbrushes, sketchbooks, and a small folder with drawings. Her name was Carla Smith, an art student and medical assistant. She had been collaborating with a local artist, posing for street scenes that simulated urban life. Rourke, now fully immersed in the case, soon noticed that the scene was not only evocative, it was reproduced. One of the sketches found in Carla's folder showed a pose almost identical to his own. It had been drawn weeks earlier, as if someone had already frozen it on paper before killing her. The forensic report repeated the same liturgy. Sedation, then exposure to monoxide. No signs of a struggle. The skin was clean. Fingernails freshly painted, and a barely visible line of blue paint on the heel of her right shoe. Rourke needed no further confirmation. The killer was now not just reenacting scenes, he was planning them. A fortnight later, at the entrance to the subway, another figure appeared, sitting on the corner of the steps with a heavy coat and an empty cardboard cup by her feet. The expression was docile, lost, as if waiting for something that would never come. She was Harley Ford, a homeless woman. Her history was extensive: drug abuse, prostitution, several admissions for minor altercations. No one had looked for her. No one had noticed her absence. Only the cleaners noticed that her body was unresponsive at dawn. Rourke paused in front of her longer than with the others, not out of pity, but out of anger. For in Harley, the killer did not seek to reflect life. He sought to reflect indifference, the everydayness of looking the other way. His death was not just a scene, it was a message. No one looks until it's too late. A later report linked Harley to a party thrown by the same artist Carla had worked with. No one remembered if they ever met. But in the world of local bohemia, faces crossed without being noticed. Then came the most disturbing image. One man, standing, leaning against a pedestrian traffic light, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. No one recognized him. He had no documents, no identity. In the briefcase, empty, traces of white powder were found. And the shoes, they had modified soles with lead plates, enough to maintain his posture when he was placed, preventing him from slipping as his body stiffened. In his hair, dead lice. On his shirt, remains of jute. His death was the same as the others, but its representation was another, a symbol of routine, of the anonymous worker, an archetypal silhouette. It had no name, just a posture. But the scene that broke Mercer's emotional equilibrium was not an urban performance. It was something more intimate, more cruel. An elderly couple sitting on a park bench. Both were holding binoculars. They were looking at the sky. They pretended to be birdwatching, but they were dead. The medical report revealed advanced Alzheimer's in both of them. They lived in an assisted living facility. They had disappeared in the early morning, unnoticed by the staff. They had been sedated with a delicate mixture of drugs. There was no violence, but there was a forced tenderness, as if the killer wanted to remember what is lost over time. The image was not tragic. It was serene. But the crime, it was still murder. And finally, the most disconcerting. A makeshift chamber abandoned on the outskirts of the city. It had been modified with monoxide tanks and ventilation filters. Inside, they found a child, alive, barely conscious, with wet cheeks and hands painted blue. He had been sedated, but didn't inhale enough to die. They found him by accident after following a trail of spilled paint. The child did not speak. He could not explain how he got there. He did not remember the face. He only said one word: quiet. Mercer didn't sleep that night. He knew the killer had wanted to add another scene. A child's game stopped forever. But something went wrong, and with that failure came the first real chance to find him. On all the bodies, burlap fibers were present. On all the shoes, traces of paint. On Carla's lips, traces of sealing wax. On the fingers of the elderly, traces of varnish. Each scene was more elaborate, more controlled, as if the killer was rehearsing for something bigger. And then there were the photographs, some found in a dumpster near the park. Polaroids, blurry, unidentified. Images of people placed as decorative figures. Some never reported missing, others not yet dead. Or so it was hoped. The killer was not looking for victims, he was looking for models, attitudes, moments. And Mercer understood the truth that hurt him the most. The scenes were not just acts of death, they were beauty claims, made with real meat. Jersey Langston's name appeared in the investigation as certain shadows do, unintentional but impossible to ignore. There were no criminal records. He was not a public figure in the traditional sense, but among certain cultural circles in Arden Heights his name was spoken with respect and discomfort. Conceptual painter. Obsessed with the human body in a state of stillness, his work was not exhibited in museums or galleries. It was shown in alternative spaces, basements, rehabilitated warehouses, places where art and risk rubbed up against each other without asking permission. Langston painted bodies, not as portraits, not as symbols of beauty or identity. He painted them as detainees, without expression, without vitality, as if the soul had left the body just before the brush touched it. In his most commented and criticized series entitled The Gravity of the Living, he showed people posing as corpses in domestic scenes, in dining room chairs, in unmade beds, in empty train stations, all with open eyes, all perfectly still. That's how he got on Detective Mercer's radar, not because he was directly accused, but because two of the victims, Carla Smith and Harley Ford, had a link to him. Carla had been one of his models, an informal collaboration according to the archives. She appeared in at least 2 known works, depicted with her head cocked to one side, her eyes wide, her face emotionless. Langston had called her deferred tension, a portrait that after her death began to seem too literal. Harley, on the other hand, had been seen at one of the parties hosted by Langston at a studio in the industrial district. No one remembered if they talked, if she posed for him, but her presence was confirmed by photographs of the event. In one of them, Harley appears in the background, cropped by the flash, observing an installation of mannequin bodies suspended from the ceiling. When Mercer visited the artist's studio, he found a clean space. Aseptic even. White walls, brushes in order, jars of paint labeled with medical precision. There was no chaos, no dirt, but no heat either. It was a place designed to contain, not to express. Langston received the police without resistance. He showed his works, his notebooks, his visual references. He spoke of death with naturalness, not as something dark, but as something inevitable, as if his work was a way of accepting what everyone avoids. The body doesn't know it's dead, he had written in one of his notebooks. It just falls, and the world keeps believing it can wake it up. His words were not confessions, but neither were they reassuring. During the forensic review of their study, no traces of chemicals, burlap fibers, or tapes were found. There were no signs of the improvised mobile cameras, nor any indication of direct connection to the scenes. Only paintings, reference photographs, and what disturbed Mercer most, a series of unpublished drawings, sketches of people perched in urban spaces, a man at a bus stop, a woman with a telephone, an elderly couple with binoculars. They were not identical to the crime scenes, but they looked enough like them to make the trained eye tremble. Langston did not deny drawing them. He said they were exercises, ideas he never developed, that his intention was never to make them real. But in art, what is real does not depend only on the author. The question Mercer could not avoid was simple and devastating. What if someone had done it for him? The pattern was becoming clearer. The killer wasn't just acting out urban scenes. He interpreted them, he reproduced them, as if following a visual script laid out by someone else. Langston denied sharing his sketches, but some of them were published, albeit briefly, on art blogs and abandoned social media accounts. In an environment where image spreads faster than intention, any obsessive viewer could have turned those compositions into execution plans. Langston was not arrested. He cooperated. He signed every statement in the same clear, methodical handwriting as his notes. But he was marked as a figure of interest, not for what he did, but for what he may have inspired. Mercer left his study with a certainty that pained him more than any lack of evidence. The killer was not original. He was a copycat, and worse, he was an interpreter. He took someone else's ideas and transformed them into facts, in death scenes that simulated life, in tributes without permission, in tributes that no one asked for. Langston returned to his artistic routine, but his name was no longer in whispers. Now it lived in police reports, in newsrooms, in the nervous conversations of a city that no longer trusted what it saw. Because if inspiration can kill, then we are all suspects. In every horror play there is someone who does not kill, but names, who does not act, but observes, who does not touch the body, but turns it into an image. For Julian Mercer, Ellen Farrow was not a traditional suspect, but what she did was, in a way, even more disturbing. She was weaving meaning, theory, context, a philosophical framework for what others saw as madness or crime. Farrow did not live in hiding. She did not deny her work. Her name appeared frequently in alternative art publications: curator, conceptual photographer, avant-garde essayist. Her most recent project had generated controversy before death began to walk the streets of Arden Heights, a digital exhibition called Poetic Decomposition, featuring images of people posing as frozen figures in urban spaces. Some were actors, others anonymous. The aesthetic was eerily crime-like. In the weeks following the discovery of Carla Smith's body, police began to notice that certain images were circulating on art forums before the scenes were officially released. Not exact photographs, but overly accurate reconstructions. Mercer, seeing Farrow's exhibit, felt that someone had taken the crimes and turned them into discourse, into aesthetics, in concept. Ellen had worked with Carla Smith on a series of portraits for a project on invisible urban presences. Carla had posed in work uniform, sitting on public benches, pretending to sleep or wait. The images were subtle but chilling now that Carla was dead. Harley Ford had also been photographed by Farrow. No one asked for her consent. The photo showed Harley in front of a closed store, hunched over, wrapped in a dirty blanket, as part of a work called Architecture of Abandonment. When questioned, Ellen was not defensive. On the contrary, she spoke with precision, with elegance, with a coolness disguised as critical thinking. For her, death was an aesthetic manifestation. The rigidity of the body, the loss of breath, the silence afterwards, were, in her words, pure forms of absence. She said that the crimes did not horrify her. They challenged her. That if someone was executing these scenes with visual intent, then the act, though criminal, was laden with message. For Mercer, that way of speaking was not art. It was nihilism disguised as theory. Ellen maintained a personal blog called Intermittences. In it, she frequently wrote about the post-human movement, a fictional or emerging current where the body was nothing more than a visual container. In a post dated weeks before the death of the elderly men in the park, Farrow reflected on vulnerable figures as social decor, and asked, "What happens when public space does not distinguish between the living and the installed?" The coincidences were not enough to incriminate her, but they were enough to take a closer look at her. During the search of his home and studio, police found artistic correspondence between Farrow and Jersey Langston, the painter under investigation for his depictions of motionless bodies. The letters were signed with pseudonyms, L and E. But the content was unambiguous. They spoke of the representation of stillness, of the symbolic weight of urban silence. They even mentioned a common figure, Arthur Blackwood. Farrow did not deny the links. He said they were artistic dialogues, that art feeds on obscure ideas, that artists don't kill, but they do imagine. The police report found no physical evidence directly linking Farrow to the crime scenes. There were no traces of monoxide, no burlap fibers, and no substances in his possession. However, the images in her exhibit matched the killer's visual language. As if someone from the shadows was running his gallery in real life, Mercer did not see her as a direct culprit, but as something even more complex, a mind that shaped the context, that could have inspired, guided, or simply pushed someone over the edge. The most disturbing possibility was not that Farrow was in league with the killer. It was that I didn't need to be. It was enough for someone to read his texts, see his images, and decide to make them a reality. To turn discourse into action, art into crime. And if that was true, how many more viewers were reading? Farrow continued to be investigated, under constant surveillance. Her exposé was withdrawn, although her defenders protested censorship. The press interviewed her on multiple occasions. She always spoke with the same calculated tone. She never said she condoned the crimes, but she never said she did not understand them. In a radio interview, he said something Mercer never forgot. Art always comes before the law. Throughout the investigation, Julian Mercer had learned to distrust silence. Not the kind found at crime scenes, but the kind that shrouds certain names. Those who do not appear on any list, who are not cited by witnesses, but who are present in every shadow of the case. Thus emerged Arthur Blackwood, not as a criminal, but as a figure who seemed to occupy a place that no one had given him, but which he had already assigned himself. Blackwood was a man of few public words. 44 years old, a construction contractor on irregular jobs, no apparent artistic profile, except for those who knew the forums where his images circulated under pseudonyms. There he called himself Anonymous. In those spaces, his name did not matter, only his ideas. His digital compositions showed disturbing scenes. Human bodies stopped in everyday life. People perched at traffic lights, bus stops, park benches. The poses were eerily similar to the victims found in Arden Heights. It was that coincidence that prompted Mercer to apply for a warrant to review his digital history. What they found raised more questions than it answered. In a former municipal competition, Blackwood had submitted a project entitled Suspended Urban Instance. The images were crude, made with rudimentary design programs but with an undeniable compositional sense. Among them, one sketch showed a woman with a telephone next to a lamppost, another, an elderly couple with binoculars, yet another, an executive with a briefcase. All signed with initials, all rejected. The official reason: lack of technical execution and diffuse concept. None of that seemed to matter now. During the search of his apartment, the police found a room converted into a makeshift studio. On the walls, dozens of low-quality prints, some crossed out, others with annotations in the margins. Correct gesture, better framing, more natural posture. There were photographs taken in public spaces, including the park where Carla Smith appeared. In a folder marked Real References, portraits of unknown persons were found, apparently taken without their consent. There were no weapons, there were no criminal blueprints, but the content seemed to function as a mental log, a record of ideas that someone might have decided to take beyond art. In one corner, a cardboard model showed a miniature version of a street. There were plastic figures, hand-painted, posed in different postures. On the floor, traces of blue paint, traces of tape, burlap fibers glued as decoration. A play scene, or rehearsal. Mercer felt it in his stomach. That mixture of certainty and impossibility. As if the truth was there, but covered by a thin layer of simulation. As if Blackwood had done nothing, but dreamed it all. During the interrogation, Arthur did not deny his work. He spoke of his frustrations as an artist, of his rejection by the Arden Heights cultural scene. He said that the system did not accept proposals that made him uncomfortable, that he just wanted to be seen, that the city needed to relearn how to look, and that if anyone had taken his ideas, it was because they were worthwhile. When asked about the similarities with the crimes, he barely smiled. He said that art often overtakes reality, that sometimes reality catches up with it. There was no DNA from him at the scenes, no records of chemical purchases, but his aesthetic presence was undeniable. His images preceded the deaths. His ideas reflected in the form, the pose, even in the choice of certain public spaces. Her text spoke of installing the body as a social mirror, of breaking invisibility with physical silence, phrases that, in any other context, would only be part of an artistic manifesto. But now they seemed to echo something much darker. Rourke, after reading all his writings, noted in his report, "He doesn't need to kill to sign. He just needs to be subpoenaed." Blackwood was released under surveillance. The evidence was insufficient to arrest him. The coincidences were disturbing but not definitive. His defenders spoke of artistic persecution, his critics of symbolic manipulation. But for Mercer, he represented a new form of authorship, one where thought could provoke acts without executing them. A figure whose greatest creation was an idea that others turned into a corpse. Was he the killer, or simply the scriptwriter of a play with no official performers? That ambiguity was his protection, and his deepest signature. In his notebook at the end, there was a sentence written in pencil, barely visible. "Art is not committed, it is left open." The investigation did not end with a gunshot, nor with a tearful confession. It ended as the great lies begin, with an image, a figure standing still on a bicycle in the center of an airtight chamber. A child still alive, staring at something that was not there. It was in that moment, seeing that small body held by the gas and the rope, that Julian Mercer understood the core of it all. It wasn't hate, nor madness. It was design. Arthur Blackwood was arrested early the next morning on the outskirts of Arden Heights. He made no attempt to flee. He made no resistance. On the contrary, he seemed to be waiting, as if the arrest itself was part of a carefully planned last scene. In his apartment, they found the laptop from where he had uploaded the images to the art blogs, images that the police discovered hours before the bodies turned up. The IP trace, crossed with the location of his phone, closed the circle. The abandoned warehouse where it operated was the final piece. It belonged to a former packaging company, known for working with natural fibers. There, in a back room, Blackwood had set up his gas chamber, a makeshift structure with rudimentary filters, monoxide tanks, and a window sealed with industrial tape. The room still smelled of rust, burnt plastic, and paint. On the floor, remnants of burlap fibers, duct tape, and fragments of white powder, the same powder that covered the shoes of some of the victims. It all fit. The bodies, it was determined, were carefully handled after death, wrapped first in gunny sacks, then washed, dressed, and arranged with grisly precision. The intention was not just to kill, but to show. Each scene was an exhibition, each victim a piece, and Arthur Blackwood, the artist who was not invited to any gallery but who turned the city into his silent museum. During the interrogation, Arthur did not confess in conventional terms. He spoke in calculated, almost theatrical phrases. He said that his victims were not important until he turned them into art, that the bodies were interrupted just before they fell into irrelevance, that his work was the pause that society did not know how to look at. When asked about the child, he said it was his final work, that no other body was so pure in gesture, that it was never his intention to harm him, only to immortalize him. For the first time, Mercer did not respond, because he knew that for Blackwood, the line between crime and creation never existed. The forensic analysis was conclusive. The fibers found in the warehouse matched those found on the victims. The paint on the floor matched the paint on the shoes. The dust on his clothes matched that of the bodies. On his laptop, there were files with the same compositions submitted and rejected in the municipal contest. The drawings were accompanied by notes: more expression missing in death, eyes open for greater impact, leg bent, arm hanging with real weight. The photographs were worse. They not only showed the final scenes, they also documented the moments before, unconscious bodies being posed, adjusted, manipulated like pieces of pottery. The care was not clinical, it was obsessive. The face of the executioner never appeared, but his signature was in every stroke, in every position. The psychological profile was devastating. Extreme narcissism, inability to distinguish between symbolism and reality, obsessed with the idea of permanence. In his writings, the theme of oblivion appeared again and again. He did not fear death. He feared invisibility. At trial, Blackwood appeared eerily calm. His lawyer built a defense on mental impairment, but the evidence was too concrete, too cold. Blackwood never showed remorse, only frustration at not being able to complete the full exhibit. He said that 4 scenes were still missing, that he was running out of ideas. The court found him guilty. Life sentence with no right of appeal. But Mercer knew that, in a way, this was not punishment for him. It was his consecration. Because in Arthur Blackwood's mind, the world was finally looking at him. The city slowly began to breathe again. The squares filled up again. Bus stops were repopulated with people pretending not to look over their shoulders. But something had changed. Arden Heights was no longer innocent. It had seen art weaponized, beauty put at the service of the sinister, and the everyday transformed into a theater of death. Mercer, for his part, wrote the final report on the case with a personal note at the end. He did not kill out of hatred nor out of desire. He killed because no one listened to him. And when he found his voice, he used it to shape the silence of others. And although the case was closed on paper, one question remained hanging in the air. Who will be the next artist willing to be heard, no matter the price? Case 3. Chicago was not quite asleep that October night. The rain fell with a gentle constancy, as if seeking to quiet the sounds that still vibrated among the downtown buildings. Traffic had vanished hours before. The lights of the apartments were slowly fading, as if the city was slowly gathering under its own skin. But on the 23rd floor of a luxury building, a window was still open. The victim's name was Amelia Harper, 32 years old, an executive in a public relations firm known for her discretion, elegance, and seemingly uneventful life. It was her sister who found her the next day when her calls went unanswered. Amelia lay on her bed, her body covered by a light blanket, her face serene, her hands relaxed, as if she were asleep. But he was not breathing. The autopsy revealed that she had been suffocated with an antique silk handkerchief carefully knotted around her neck. The tissue belonged to her grandmother, kept in a keepsake box in the bedroom closet. There were no signs of a struggle, no struggle marks, no forced entry. The bedroom window was open, letting the damp, cold breeze sweep the silence from the room. On the pillow, a bouquet of fresh red roses, perfectly arranged, no card, no fingerprints. It was not a recent gift. It hadn't been delivered by floral service. No one saw anyone go upstairs. No cameras picked up anything out of the ordinary. The scene did not scream. It did not cry for help. It was contained, unsettlingly orderly, as if Amelia had not been surprised but expected, as if she had known the moment, or at least accepted the arrival. The investigators noted the absence of violence with a mixture of bewilderment and suspicion. There was nothing stolen, there was nothing out of place. Everything seemed carefully prepared. The form of the crime did not seek chaos. It sought aesthetic silence. 5 days later, a second scene replicated the pattern, this time away from the noise and luxury. Claire Bennett, 41, lived alone in a cottage north of the city. She was a book restorer, reserved, with few friends and strict routines. She was found in the kitchen, lying next to the oak table where she usually took tea. The body was in a serene position. The face was painless. Around her neck, another silk handkerchief, almost identical to Amelia's. On the table, another bouquet of red roses, perfectly arranged. The kitchen window open, and again, not a footprint. Not a footprint. No sign of a struggle. Just the icy air seeping into the house, as if the killer had wanted to let something from outside inhabit the scene for a moment longer. The two women did not know each other. They did not share social environments, nor work or family networks. One lived among skyscrapers, the other among fields. But something united them, their way of dying, and the implicit message that seemed to be left in every corner. Crime was not violence. It was farewell. Julian Mercer, transferred to Chicago as special support after his last case, was called in at the direct request of the homicide chief. His eye for symbolic detail, his sensitivity to the unobvious, and his methodical silence were needed. The case called for more than technique. It called for emotional reading, aesthetic reading. For Mercer, what was most disturbing was not the manner of the murder. It was its choreography. The killer wasn't eliminating lives. He was creating scenes. The silk scarf, the bouquet of roses, the open window. 3 elements repeated with exactitude, like notes of a carefully written score. There was no screaming. There was no running away. Just an intimate act. Impossibly cold. Immensely human. And that precisely was what worried him the most. Because killing from hatred was easy to track, but killing from melancholy demanded another kind of look, one that perhaps no one was prepared to hold. For Julian Mercer, the most disturbing murders were not the chaotic or bloody ones. They were the ones that didn't scream, the ones that were sustained in absolute calm, in an orderly beauty, as if, at the moment of death, someone had wanted to preserve an emotion rather than erase it. The deaths of Amelia Harper and Claire Bennett seemed unrelated. They lived in different environments, worked in worlds that did not touch, and their social circles never crossed. One, an image executive in downtown Chicago. The other, a criminal lawyer who traveled constantly, accustomed to judicial conflict rather than personal contact. But Mercer wasn't looking for obvious connections. He was looking for shared rhythms, details that are not written in the files but that vibrate in the scenes. Both women were found in domestic environments, in quiet positions with no signs of a struggle. The cause of death was the same, soft asphyxiation with a carefully knotted silk handkerchief. In both cases, the scarf was personal property, not brought in from the outside but chosen from within the victim's life. That detail carried weight. It was not just a tool, it was a message. The open window in both scenes did not appear accidental. It was not escape, it was a symbol. The entrance of cold air, the contact with the night. As if the killer needed something external to touch the place of death, as if the scene would not be complete without that invisible flow. And then there were the roses, not chaotically placed, but exactly. On Amelia's pillow, on Claire's table, red roses, fresh without a card, like a farewell without sender, like a gesture that does not seek recognition but meaning. Mercer had the flowers examined. They did not come from any identifiable flower shop. They had been cut by hand. The stems had traces of white varnish on the bases, a minute detail but specific enough to suggest artisanal preparation. The killer wasn't improvising. He didn't react. He composed the scene. Background research on both women offered more questions than answers. Amelia Harper, 34, was the only child of a wealthy family. Professionally brilliant, beautiful, admired, but emotionally hermetic. Her recent medical history included therapy sessions for severe anxiety, isolation, and romantic breakups that had left a deeper mark than those around her knew. Lately, she had become more closed off. She had reduced her personal interactions. She spent more hours alone in her apartment. Her therapist, contacted under court order, had noted in her file, presents tendency to affective disconnection, fear of losing control, inability to close past attachments. Claire Bennett, 38, had a different but equally vulnerable emotional background. She was known for her professional fortitude, a woman who faced difficult cases, complicated clients, unforgiving judges. But in her private life, there was almost no one left. She had lived alone since the death of her mother. She had no steady partner or close friends. And in her personal files was a notebook with a noteworthy entry. Empty spaces don't scare me. What scares me is that no one knows what came before. Both women had had failed relationships, periods of emotional isolation, and a life carefully shielded from the outside world. Both had shielded their privacy, and yet the killer knew her well enough to enter her without leaving a trace. There were no cameras with useful captures, no witnesses, no strange phone calls, just open windows, soft scarves, and flowers. Mercer understood that he was not dealing with an impulsive criminal. He was dealing with someone who knew pain without scandal, who understood the language of women alone, not to console, but to correct, to mark his end with a calculated aesthetic, a whisper instead of a scream. The interrogation of acquaintances, neighbors, and colleagues of both victims yielded no links between them. No one could imagine what connected them beyond the way they were found. But Mercer noticed the parallels not in the facts, but in the emotions. And that, for him, was the key. I wasn't looking for a killer who hated these women. I was looking for someone who knew them well enough to understand how to represent them in death. The crime was not just murder. It was staged. And the most disturbing thing was that it left no anger behind. It left sadness, intimate sadness, directed, almost reverent. That was the type of killer Mercer feared most. The one who didn't feel like a killer at all. On the invisible map of Amelia Harper's death, Olivia Morgan's name didn't come as a surprise. It was there, floating among old emails, social photos, shared campaigns. She was a familiar figure, a friend. But as Detective Julian Mercer delved deeper into the emotional ties surrounding Amelia, Olivia's figure began to change shape. She was 29 years old. She was the owner of an enveloping presence, impeccable hair, easy smile, studied gestures. In the world of public relations, Liv was considered charming and astute. No one denied her talent, but many spoke of a certain intensity that was not always visible on the surface. Those who knew her more closely, without cameras or speeches, said there was something about her that clung to people, a way of not letting go. He had met Amelia in college. They became inseparable over the years. They shared projects, clients, even partners within the same circle. But something slowly snapped. Years later, Amelia rose more quickly. Her campaigns were winning awards. Her name was beginning to carry weight in the media. Olivia, on the other hand, left the company to open her own path. A smaller venture, more modest, less celebrated. Investigators discovered that in the months leading up to the murder, Amelia and Olivia had had a heated argument, following a campaign in which Olivia sought to involve a celebrity with whom Amelia had already worked. The exchange was cold, cordial on the surface, but some leaked messages showed tension, emotional possession, reproaches that were sent not as enemies, but as friends who had stopped recognizing each other. Mercer wasn't looking for obvious motives, but one detail did catch his attention. Olivia had been in contact with Amelia days before her death. A brief message, cryptic. "I have something I want to tell you. "I can't keep it in anymore, see you?" Amelia didn't reply. That phrase, repeated on the screen of the analyzed phone, seemed an echo of something deeper. Not just disagreement, not just competition. It was an attempt at reconciliation or warning. When questioned, Olivia stated that she had been out of town the weekend of the murder, a spa retreat with a group of girlfriends. However, the place she mentioned had no record of her name, nor payments on her card. And none of the people who allegedly accompanied her recalled seeing her directly during the early morning in question. His phone, upon checking the signal history, had been out of coverage for several hours, neither connected to networks nor trackable by GPS. The gap coincided with the window of time when Amelia was killed. It was an incomplete alibi, and for Mercer, incomplete alibis were not always false, but they were dangerous. Decorative elements similar to those found at the crime scene were found in Olivia's apartment, scented candles of the same type as Amelia's, a bottle of the same perfume. Nothing incriminating in itself, but the similarities suggested a form of mimicry, as if she had wanted to replicate the environment of the person who was once her reflection. And then her shadow. Olivia's psychological profile indicated a dependent personality. Intelligent but effectively unstable. There was a history of abruptly severed friendships, intense, brief relationships followed by long periods of emotional distance. In a previous interview for a style magazine, she had said, "People think I'm charming because I smile, but in reality, if someone walks away from me, it feels like an amputation." The phrase was quoted by Mercer in its report, not as evidence, but as a possible emotional clue. The idea that Amelia would have wanted to walk away, that she had closed the door, and that Olivia, unable to accept that separation, would have sought a last form of control, of presence. It didn't seem so unlikely. But there was no evidence. There were no fingerprints, no traces of fibers, no DNA. Just an all-too-sharp emotional void between two women who once called each other sisters. And yet Mercer did not rule it out. Because in crimes where there is beauty in the scene, there was almost always love before the pain. And Liv Morgan was certainly a woman who didn't know how to let go. In the cleanest investigations, poison doesn't show up at the crime scene. It shows up in hallway conversation, in emails forwarded without context, in the tense smiles shared in obligatory meetings. For Julian Mercer, the professional environment can conceal forms of violence that never erupt in words, but can do so in deeds. Sarah Lawson was 32 years old, intelligent, ambitious, impeccably dressed, always on the verge of a smile that was never quite warm. She worked at the same firm as Claire Bennett, the second victim. They were part of the same team, but not the same practice. Claire was visceral, tough, a fierce advocate who lived for her clients. Sarah, on the other hand, was tactical, calculating, specialized in complex contracts, quiet in her way forward. Both respected each other, but everyone knew they couldn't stand each other. Months before the murder, Claire had been promoted to a senior position in litigation, a position coveted by many, particularly Sarah. The committee had considered her, but ultimately went with Claire. The decision was justified by her experience in high-profile cases, but what remained in the air, and Mercer sensed it when talking to the firm's employees, was the bitter taste of a choice that not everyone thought was fair. Sarah did not express it openly, she never did, but some remembered phrases in the weeks after the promotion, single sentences, comments that, if you paid attention to them, revealed a crack. Not all that glitters lasts in this place. Sometimes promotions are more political than professional. Words like that, spoken softly, might sound innocuous, but Mercer read them as small detonations, not yet activated. On the night of the murder, Sarah claimed to have been in an after-hours meeting, reviewing a case with a colleague in a room in the same building. However, there was no solid evidence of her presence there. The firm's cameras did not capture her during the critical time slot. The access system recorded no movement, and the colleague in question, questioned afterwards, said that the meeting had been called off at the last minute. When asked about it, Sarah simply said that she had been left to work alone, that she needed to clear her mind, that she didn't leave right away because she didn't have anyone waiting for her at home. That sentence was left floating around. It wasn't an excuse, it was context. On his desk were found papers organized with surgical neatness, no personal notes, no photographs. But in her computer history, digital forensics found strange searches, information about Claire, old addresses, articles about past cases, press releases from the last 5 years, even a family history search log. None of these searches were illegal. but all of them together spoke of unconfessed obsession. Mercer took note of something else. Sarah had worked closely with Claire on a sensitive case months earlier. According to internal documents, Claire had made substantial corrections to Sarah's brief, arguing, lack of argumentative cogency. Since then, communication between the two was minimal. In an internal conversation recorded by protocol, Sarah wrote to Claire, "Don't worry, not everyone can shine from the first try." Claire did not respond. It was not a threat. It wasn't a direct insult. But Mercer knew that emotions that aren't expressed clearly tend to build up, and the pent-up in people like Sarah can turn into something much darker. The autopsy yielded no elements that physically linked Sarah to the murder. There were no fingerprints, there were no fibers, no DNA. But the pattern of the crime, the handkerchief used, the tidy scene, the precisely placed rose, did not demand direct physical violence. It demanded intimacy, time, emotional coolness, and Sarah had all of that. He had the kind of presence that could go unnoticed in a place like Claire's house. She had been there before, on social visits from the firm. She was no stranger to that environment. She could move about in it without arousing suspicion. When she was formally questioned, she did not flinch. She kept her composure. She answered clearly. She never contradicted herself, but something in her voice seemed rehearsed. Too correct. Too clean. When asked about Claire, he said he respected her, that they were not friends but colleagues, that he regretted her death. And then, unprompted, she added one more sentence. She knew how to get attention even without meaning to. Mercer did not note the phrase for its content. He noted it by tone. In his report, the detective wrote a single line under the name Sarah Lawson. Silence is not always innocent. Sometimes it's just waiting for someone to translate it. There was no proof, but there was something more difficult to refute. The shadow of a resentment that he didn't know when it ended up growing. And in that kind of shadow, sometimes death can find form. The shadow that grows within the same surname, Julian Mercer knew that older ties didn't always mean affection. Sometimes they were just that, ancient, and family ties didn't protect against resentment. They only covered it with a thin blanket, the kind that tears with time. When Emily Harper's name appeared among the records, it was not by surprise but by omission. No one mentioned her at first. Her name barely appeared in the obituaries. Her face did not appear in the press releases. But there it was, on the death certificate signature, on the list of legal relatives, on the notice of ownership of Amelia's apartment. The victim's younger sister. He was 26 years old, and the first thing Mercer noticed in his file was his absence. Not in the papers, in Amelia's life. They weren't sharing recent photos. There were no exchanges of messages in recent months. No trace of celebrated birthdays, family dinners, or late-night phone calls. Emily was, it seemed, the silent part of the Harper family name. When interviewing some of Amelia's acquaintances, the responses were similar. Yes, she had a sister, I think. They didn't talk much. They were very different. And they were. Amelia lived on the surface of things. She was bright, social, careful with every word. Emily, on the other hand, moved on the margins, introverted, unstable. She had been in trouble with the law as a teenager. Petty theft, brief escapes, nothing serious, but enough to draw an invisible line between her and her older sister's perfect structure. Over the years, Emily did not appear at important family events. She did not attend Amelia's graduation, nor did she attend her work parties. She was only seen once, according to witnesses, at an art show where Amelia was giving a speech, and she left before it was over. When she was summoned to testify, Emily arrived alone. No lawyer, no makeup, in a jacket too big for the weather. Her voice was low but firm. She said she hadn't seen Amelia for weeks, that they had no problems but no closeness either, that she wasn't like her sister and never wanted to be. But security cameras in the building where Amelia lived showed something else. Emily had been there, 2 nights before the murder. I had no bag, just a book and a small bag. She entered without knocking, using her own access code. She was inside the apartment for 43 minutes. Then she left without being seen by more cameras. When Mercer asked her about this visit, Emily said she'd gone to drop off some old personal items, that Amelia wasn't there, but she knew how to get in, that they didn't stay to talk, that it was brief, too brief. The curious thing was that there was nothing altered at the crime scene. No new box, no foreign objects, nothing to indicate the delivery of belongings. Even stranger was his alibi. Emily claimed to have been at a local bar on the night of the crime. Some witnesses confirmed that they saw her arrive shortly after midnight, but there were no entry logs, no card payments, just fuzzy testimony. No one could tell if she arrived before or after the likely time of Amelia's death. That margin, so narrow, so gray, was enough to make Mercer dig deep. Because what weighed the most was not his silence, nor his evasive look, nor his broken voice when he spoke of Amelia. That's what it didn't say. In her psychological profile, elaborated by the team analyst, elusive personality traits were identified. A weakened self-image marked by chronic feelings of inferiority and detachment. Since childhood, she had lived under the shadow of her sister's success. Amelia was the golden daughter, the promise fulfilled. Emily, the discordant note. She never put it into words, but she lived it, every day for years. In his social networks, few, closed, almost without activity, there was only one publication in the days after the crime. An old image, 2 girls on the beach, one looking at the camera, the other with her back turned, no text, no context. Just a photograph that said more than any statement. In his room, while searching his belongings, the agents found a box of mementos, fragments of childhood, a broken bracelet, a letter written in blue ink that was never sent. Signed, Emily. The letter spoke of a wound never closed, of feeling invisible, of not knowing if the affection Amelia showed him as a child was real, or an act of duty. And while there was nothing about her that physically linked her to the murder, the simple fact that she had been there, in the apartment days before, that she had left her presence among her sister's private things, and that she had arrived at the bar just as Amelia was dying, meant that her name could not be ruled out. Mercer did not judge her, but neither did he ignore it. He jotted down in his notebook a single sentence, without beating around the bush. Resentment between siblings doesn't always scream, sometimes it just waits. In the end, it wasn't physical evidence or a hidden recording that solved the case. It was something slower, denser, like a curtain that falls on its own when there is no more play to perform. The truth, in its rawest form, did not appear all at once. It seeped. It was coming out between cracks like accumulated humidity. And Julian Mercer, with the patience of someone who has already seen too much, picked it up piece by piece. Olivia Morgan's name had been there from the beginning, but never at the center. She was the kind of figure people remembered fondly. Bright, kind, charming. A woman with presence, a woman of speech. No one mentioned her with suspicion. Her closeness with Amelia Harper seemed natural, almost sisterly. But right there, where everything seemed harmonious, Mercer felt something vibrate differently. The details were slowly falling out. Her alibi first proved shaky. She claimed to have been at a spa retreat with friends the night Amelia was killed, but the records were sketchy. There were no payments on his card. No one could say for sure where she was between 11 a.m. and 3 a.m. She was not sure where she was between 11 a.m. and 3 a.m. And most disturbingly, her phone had remained without a signal for more than 2 hours, in the middle of the city, as if it had been deliberately deactivated. Claire Bennett's death reinforced suspicions. 2 women, 2 identical scenes, the same silk scarf, the red roses without a card, the windows open to the cold night air. The symbolic imprint of the killer was as marked as his physical absence. And yet everything at the scenes looked more like an installation than a crime. As if someone had wanted to capture not only the end of a life, but an idea. Olivia's confession came quietly. It was more of an outpouring than a delivery. She didn't cry, she didn't plead. She just spoke, with a clarity that shook more than any tears. His crime had not been impulsive. It had been designed, not motivated by direct hatred, but by something colder, a need to clean up the environment, to purge the imperfect. She said Amelia had been her friend for years, but over time she began to see her as a hollow figure. Successful, yes, admired no doubt, but superficial, artificial. A face everyone applauded without wondering what was behind it. Olivia couldn't stand that image. It felt invasive, oppressive, like a reflection that overruled her. Claire, on the other hand, represented another form of presence, strong, confident, impenetrable. Both in her mind were part of a noise that distanced her from her own center. The most disturbing thing wasn't what Olivia said. It was the way she said it, as if she had not committed a crime but carried out a restoration, an environmental adjustment, a balancing act. The red flowers were not tribute. They were not an apology. They were the symbol of what she valued. Restrained beauty, perfect form, quiet presence. The roses did not speak. They did not demand. They just were. In her mind, they were to replace those who no longer had a place. A flower on a pillow was not a gesture of love. It was an aesthetic correction, a way to mark the place where, according to her logic, there had been disorder. The use of the silk scarf was even more calculated. He did not bring the weapon with him. He took it from the victim's own belongings. Always an intimate handkerchief, antique, personal. No visible trace of violence. There was no struggle, no blood, only the silence afterwards, the stillness, as if the act of killing was a way of calming, of returning the body to a state she considered more dignified. But it was the open windows that caught Mercer's attention the most. That repeated gesture couldn't be casual, and it wasn't. Olivia explained coolly. To her, each window was a symbolic exit, a door for herself, a space through which crime could leave her, as if by opening them, what she had done no longer belonged to her. It was her way of letting go of the scene and leaving new. During the investigation, digital records closed the case completely. Olivia had searched online for methods of sleeping without leaving a chemical trace, silent asphyxiation techniques, floral symbolism, natural ventilation and death without visible trauma. In her apartment, enough evidence was found. Images of the victims taken before their deaths, carefully archived, notes on color symbolism, fragments of personal writings that spoke of purification through order. A box, hidden in a false bottom of the closet, contained objects taken from the victims. No jewelry, no money, small scraps of no apparent value, a lock of hair, an empty envelope, a diary sheet with an underlined sentence. They were, for Olivia, remnants of what had to go, traces of the mess she had corrected. The trial was swift. The evidence was clean, the confession unappealable. Olivia was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She showed no reaction upon hearing the sentence. She did not look down. She did not tremble. She only blinked slowly, as if each word of the judge confirmed to her that her work had, at last, been recognized. Mercer closed the case report with steady hands, not out of indifference but out of respect, because he knew that what he had faced was not just a killer. It was a perverse ideology, a way of looking at the world and deciding without emotion who deserved to stay and who should be replaced. In his final note, he wrote that not all murderers act out of rage. Some do it for aesthetics, and those in many ways are the most difficult to identify. Because they don't leave screams, they leave beautiful scenes. Bodies arranged as if they had not died, but had been arrested just before the fall, with flowers, with silk, with windows open to the night. And then silence is no consolation. Silence simply remains. Case 4. The first body appeared in a random early morning with no previous signs, no warnings, just an inert presence in the wrong place. A man, 34 years old, lay on the wet asphalt of an alley 3 blocks from the train station in downtown Chicago. No one heard him scream. No one saw him fall. Not a drop of blood outside of what was necessary. And yet his body was empty. Exactly empty. His name was Brian Kelly. He led an ordinary life working as a technician in a telecommunications company with no prior record, no visible enemies. He was found with his eyes closed, his arms at his sides, as if he had decided to lie there of his own free will. But on his abdomen a thin, clean line with a curvature so perfect that it didn't seem to have been made in anger or haste. It was surgical. Inside, her left kidney was gone. The cut had not caused a mess. There were no marks on his clothes, no signs of a struggle, just an incision internally sutured, as if the objective was not to kill, but to intervene. The police arrived without understanding what kind of crime was being observed. There were no shell casings, no blows, no witnesses, just a body, a missing organ, and an impenetrable silence. 3 weeks later, the second murder occurred. This time, not in an alley, but in a luxury apartment in Lincoln Park. The victim, Angela Parker, a renowned lawyer activist known for her public campaigns. Someone used to dealing with conflict, but not threats. She was found in her bed, lying on the still warm sheets. Nothing was out of place. The door locked, the windows sealed. The alarm registered no activation. There was no forced entry, no noises, no calls. Only the body, impeccably clean, face relaxed, hands clasped on his belly, and on his chest a horizontal cut, made with such mastery that at first it went unnoticed. But inside his heart was gone. There was no blood on the bed, No bruises, just the absence. Again, there were no prints, no DNA, no tools, just a result, an empty body, and the echo of a presence that left no shadow. The third was Luis Garcia, a 28-year-old literature professor, found on the grass of a public park on a cloudy morning. He was a young man, passionate about his work, with no known enemies. He was dressed in jogging clothes. The body was found by a woman walking her dog. At first glance, he appeared to be asleep. Only as she approached, she noticed that he was not breathing, that he wasn't moving, that something about his posture was definite. His liver had been removed. Again, no signs of struggle, no visible pain, no mess. The three bodies shared a perfect logic, an aesthetics of emptiness. Each one had been intervened as if it were a clinical procedure, an operation out of time. The surgical precision of the incisions left no doubt. Whoever had done it was not improvised. He had knowledge, technique, maybe even practice. And yet that was not what most troubled Detective Julian Mercer, summoned after the second crime, when the patterns became impossible to ignore. What disturbed him most was the silence, not only the absence of noise during the crimes, but the emotional absence. The killer left no sign of rage, nor of pleasure. He did not sign his acts with flowers, symbols, or personal objects. He did not take anything beyond the extracted organ. He did not leave messages. He did not alter the scene. Everything that occurred was selective elimination, total precision, then nothing. Organs were not found in any case. No trafficking was evident, no links to illegal clinics. The country's organ bank showed no suspicious movements, and the bodies showed no trace of common chemicals or sedatives, just the end result. For Mercer, the pattern was not just medical, he was metaphysical. The killer wasn't just harvesting organs, he extracted symbols. A kidney, filtration, cleansing. A heart, emotion, connection. A liver, regeneration, vitality. Each with symbolic weight, each removed with reverence. Chicago, used to visceral crimes, didn't know how to read this series. There was no screaming. There was no blood, just quiet bodies. Postures that didn't ask for help, as if the dead had accepted their fate before the last heartbeat. And that was the hardest thing to accept: accuracy, calmness, and the fact that most likely no one knew who would be next. For Detective Julian Mercer, the true center of a crime is never in the body. It is in the void that surrounds it, in what is not left, in what is not seen. And in this case, the void was surgical, precise, a void without rage, no clutter, only intention. 3 bodies, 3 organs removed, no witnesses, no noise, no blood out of place. It was as if the killer not only knew how to cut, but how to disappear. The first was Brian Kelly, 34 years old, civil engineer, meticulous, disciplined, reserved man. The autopsy showed that the kidney was removed with an impeccable technique. There was no excessive bleeding. There was no tearing. The killer had sutured internally before leaving the body. In his medical records, a number of recent hospital visits were found, laboratory tests, a couple of imaging studies, nothing alarming, nothing out of the ordinary, but consistent. His friends commented that lately he was quieter, more introspective. He had no partner. He had no enemies. He had canceled an outing the day before, citing fatigue. He said he needed to sleep. Apparently he did, and he never woke up again. The second body was Angela Parker, 39 years old, criminal defense lawyer, famous in her environment for her coolness in court. Ambitious, lonely, she had no close contact with her family, no steady partner. Her colleagues said she lived to work, that her personal life was just a line between work paragraphs. When she was found in her bed, everything was tidy, clothes in place, the wallet untouched. The security alarm activated and deactivated by someone with knowledge of the code. Her heart had been removed without rib fractures, a procedure that required not only anatomical knowledge but experience in opening bodies without damaging them. Not just any doctor could do it, and without anesthesia, no one but a professional could do it without giving himself away. Angela had received no threats. She was not involved in any active lawsuits, but her record was full of decisions that generated enmity. She defended men many would have preferred to see behind bars, but Mercer wasn't looking for loud enemies. He knew that sometimes crime arises not from direct conflict, but from disinterest, from coldness that accumulates until it becomes unbearable. The third was Luis Garcia, 28 years old, literature teacher at a high school in the south of the city. He had no partner, no complaints. He lived alone. His routine was stable, almost monastic. He read, he taught, he slept, he repeated. In recent weeks, some colleagues noticed anxiety, fatigue, comments about the emotional weight of the job, but nothing more. His body was found on the grass of a park in a resting position, as if the murderer had placed him there with care, as if it were a facility, not a crime scene. His liver had been removed, and like the previous ones, the procedure was clean, efficient, almost respectful. Autopsies confirmed the same technique, the same type of incision, the same depth of cut, the same lack of signs of struggle or chemical sedation detected by toxicological analysis. The killer did not use force. He used no common tools, just knowledge and control. But what disturbed Mercer most was what connected the victims not superficially but symbolically. One kidney, one heart, one liver, vital organs, but also representations. The kidney as a filter, the organ that purifies. The heart as a universal symbol of love but also of emotional pain. The liver, the only organ that can regenerate, associated with renewal, with inner balance. Why those? Why one in each victim? None of them had a life that directly connected them. They did not share workplaces nor similar routines. There were no crossovers on social networks, no calls, no messages, no obvious pattern, but there was loneliness. Brian, meticulous and quiet. Angela, powerful and distant. Louise, sensitive and isolated. All three lived with a different form of silence. One structured, one self-imposed, an emotional one. And the killer seemed to know them, not as personal acquaintances, but as psychological structures. That, for Mercer, was worse. It meant that this was not an impulsive crime. It was not even personal. It was conceptual, cold, perhaps ideological, a human experiment, a form of selective intervention, where the killer decided which organ represented the defect, the symptom, or the essence of his victim. Brian feared for his health. He received the wound right in the organ that symbolizes leakage. Angela lived without affection. She lost her heart. Luis was broken by emotional exhaustion. His liver was removed as if denying him the ability to regenerate. It was a theory, but it was not weak. Mercer knew that the darkest crimes weren't the ones that left the most blood. They were the ones that left questions without form, crimes without a signature, faceless, just precision. And this killer was a perfectionist. There are professionals who, even after disappearing from the public eye, continue to breathe within their disciplines like silent ghosts. For Detective Julian Mercer, Dr. Richard Daniels' name emerged like this, not as a scream, but as a badly closed scar. He was 50 years old, a general surgeon for more than 2 decades. In his prime, he was considered one of the most precise in his specialty. He participated in complex operations, signed medical articles, and lectured. But behind his prestige was something growing in the shadows. Unauthorized procedures, patients who did not wake up, complaints that did not go to trial, but did go to review. And finally, the fall. He lost his medical license after a scandal that was never fully cleared up. He was accused of performing experimental procedures without consent, risky operations that were not on record. One woman died after an operation he denied having authorized. Another had fatal complications after an undocumented transplant. The medical community isolated him. His name disappeared from the operating rooms, and little by little from the public world. But the body never forgets what the hands learned. Dr. Daniels retired to the outskirts of the city. He lived alone, no family nearby. His home was modest, almost devoid of personal decor. However, in the basement, during a later search, the police found medical books still underlined. Folders with recent surgical notes and a detailed anatomical model showing specific incisions on vital organs. It was not illegal to have such material, but it was disturbing. For it was clear that, in his mind, the surgery was not over. The bodies found, Brian Kelly, Angela Parker, and Luis Garcia, showed an almost perfect surgical execution, not only in the type of cut, but in the anatomical intent. Each incision avoided damaging unnecessary major arteries. Each extraction seemed to be done with technical purpose rather than violence. And that was consistent with older reports of Dr. Daniels' work. He left no jagged edges. He allowed himself no mistakes. His signature was not chaos, it was efficiency. When questioned, Daniels did not deny his past, nor did he show remorse. He spoke calmly, as if the facts were part of an academic file. He said he had nothing to do with the murders. He stated that he no longer practiced surgery, that he was retired with no interest in returning. But when asked about the type of incisions found on the bodies, he couldn't help a slight inflection in his voice. A pause, as if he recognized something he could not name. His alibi was weak. He claimed to have been at home during the murders. Alone, no visitors, no phone calls, no records of electronic activity. His router disconnected, his phone in airplane mode. The silence of his life did not help confirm his innocence, but neither was there direct evidence linking him to the scenes. And yet Mercer couldn't shake the feeling that Daniels wasn't as disconnected as he pretended. Several doctors at the hospital where he once worked mentioned seeing him in hallways on different occasions, not in surgical areas, but in libraries, cafeterias, auditoriums. He did not have authorization, but neither did he generate alarm. He was an old face, familiar, just another name deactivated in the system. A security camera recorded him leaving a hospital a week before Angela Parker's murder. He was carrying a folder. No one knew what was in it. The movement was not reported as suspicious, but his presence in retrospect left questions. In the folder, later recovered in a second record, was a series of medical notes, diagrams, comparative studies of organs. On one of the folios, a handwritten phrase read, "The human body in the wrong hands is noise. In the right hands, it is sheet music." Mercer did not find that phrase a direct threat, but it was an unsettling echo, because the crimes he was investigating were not impulsive. They were scores, each with its tempo, with its instrument, with its missing organ. Daniels had the technique, the story, the implied motive. He had been removed from the podium, removed from his world, and that kind of fall can become necessity, not for revenge, but of reaffirmation. Murder in that context would not be a discharge. It would be an unauthorized operation, a class without students, an exhibition without applause, and in each victim the cut. And after each cut, nothing. Because if Daniels was responsible, he wasn't killing out of rage. He was killing out of conviction, to prove that I could still, that his knowledge had not become rusty, that his art was not dead. But up to that point, nothing incriminated him. I was just suggesting it. And in the darkest cases, suggestion is the first scalpel. The biotech lab, with its cool lights and tidy tables, used to be the sanctuary of knowledge. However, in the background of its sterile rooms, there was a man whose name began to echo in the corridors of medical research like a disturbing echo. 29-year-old William Hayes had journeyed through the world of science with the ambition of transforming cell regeneration and transplantation into something revolutionary. But his path, marked by unethical and questionable practices, had alienated him from the community that had once embraced him. William's career began with promise and discovery. He excelled in the field of biotechnology, working in a laboratory specializing in organ transplantation, where his ideas on cell regeneration were considered groundbreaking. However, the same innovative spirit led him to cross boundaries that others had refused to transgress. His obsession with improving the quality of human organs pushed him to experiment clandestinely, using unconventional and sometimes illegal methods. Rumors that he had manipulated human tissue and conducted tests without consent spread quickly, and the laboratory, which had once seen him grow up, became his latest venue. Eventually, his practices led to his dismissal, leaving him without a place in the formal scientific community, but with an unquenchable thirst to prove that his knowledge was still intact. The clues that emerged in the investigation of the case began to point to a pattern in which the meticulousness and precision of the organ removals matched the kind of technique that a high-caliber surgeon or experimenter might execute. At each of the 3 crime scenes, the removal of a vital organ, the kidney in the first case, the heart in the second, and the liver in the third, was performed with a delicacy that suggested not only surgical skill, but meticulous planning. Although the removal was carried out without violence, the coldness of each intervention left no doubt that the perpetrator knew the inner workings of the human body. Early investigations revealed that, despite William's alibi, the chronology of events began to intertwine with his possible presence in the city. He claimed to have been on a business trip out of the country during the crimes, but flight records were confusing and did not strongly support his absence. Digital traces and communications inconsistently showed that he had had recent contact with some of the local hospitals where the victims were treated. It was even discovered that William had briefly visited one of those health centers on days close to one of the murders, under pretexts related to a follow-up consultation for an internal transplant investigation. That contradiction, subtle as it was, sparked a nagging doubt in Detective Mercer. For Mercer, the killer's modus operandi, the surgical extraction with no signs of violence, the absence of fingerprints, and the cold perfectionism of execution, evoked the image of someone who had not only studied anatomy, but had immersed himself in the science of organ regeneration and replacement. William Hayes, with his history of controversial experiments and his banishment from the institutional setting, fit that profile. His technical expertise allowed him to carry out precise interventions, and his desire to regain lost recognition could have turned into an obsession that pushed him to perform experiments on human bodies without their consent. The investigative atmosphere became increasingly tense as details were analyzed. Forensics confirmed that the incisions on the bodies were too precise to be attributable to an impulsive act or a common thief. The technique was comparable to that of advanced medical procedures, performed by someone with a skilled hand and in-depth knowledge of human anatomy. In reviewing old medical records, Mercer found records of unauthorized experiments that mentioned William Hayes. Documents that, although never presented at trial, suggested that the young scientist had attempted to perform experimental procedures with a radical approach, seeking to enhance human organs through direct interventions. As the evidence accumulated, the image of William Hayes was transformed from that of a marginalized professional to that of a man capable of committing acts that defied not only the law, but the very ethics of medicine itself. Each new piece of information seemed to add up to a macabre puzzle. The precision of the incisions, the lack of signs of struggle, the orderly disappearance of vital organs, and the absence of disorder at the crime scenes. Everything pointed to a calculated, almost scientific execution. In the course of the investigation, digital records were discovered showing intense internet searches for organ preservation techniques, methods of harvesting without leaving a visible scar, and advanced surgical procedures. Combining these searches with William's recent visits to local hospital facilities established a disturbing connection. In addition, some colleagues in the biotechnology field recalled seeing him in online discussion forums, where his comments about human regeneration and the new era of transplantation had an almost apocalyptic tone, as if the end of humanity depended on his ability to reinvent it. For Mercer, the evidence was inconclusive. William Hayes claimed that he was on a trip and that his only contact with the city had been on routine professional business. However, the inconsistency in his alibi and the correlation between the pattern of the murders and the technical skill required to carry them out made his figure stand out. No surgical tools directly linked to him were found at the crime scenes, nor biological remains that could be unequivocally associated with his hands. But in such meticulous cases, the absence of direct evidence did not eliminate the possibility. What troubled Mercer most was the possibility that, in the pursuit of regeneration and the enhancement of life, William had crossed the invisible line between ethical science and homicidal experimentation. The question lingering in the detective's mind was one that kept repeating itself without clear answers. Could a man expelled from his professional community justify stealing organs from innocent individuals as part of a personal experiment? The answer, in the obscure logic that sometimes rules in the abysses of scientific ambition, seemed more complex than imagined. William Hayes had been on the verge of recognition. His fall from grace was not the end of his quest, but the beginning of an obsession to prove that his knowledge and skill could, even without official approval, transform human life, or at least what he considered an improved version of it. Mercer, while compiling each report, each piece of information, could not stop thinking about the coldness with which the crimes had been executed, in the precise inhumanity of each incision, in the meticulousness that differentiated a common killer from someone who operated like a surgeon in a clandestine operating room. William Hayes, with his past marked by medical controversies and his expulsion from the institutional field, fit that profile. He was not the image of an impulsive or chaotic killer, but that of an experimenter who, having lost his status and his voice, decided to impose his vision by force, taking from the victims what he considered defective, and leaving them as mere pieces in a macabre exhibition. However, something was still missing from the puzzle. William's alibi, though weak, did not place him at the crime scene directly, but the underhanded interaction with hospitals and the correlation of his digital searches with the technique observed at the scenes created a link that was hard to ignore. The transplant lab from which he was fired, the frustration he must have felt at seeing his work discredited, and the isolation that pushed him toward alternative methods were all part of a narrative that suggested, but did not prove, his involvement, Mercer concluded that, in such delicate and precise cases, indirect evidence could be as revealing as direct evidence. The perfection with which the murders were executed, the absence of signs of violence or error, and the similarity in technique could not be the result of chance. William Hayes, in his quest to prove that he still had the ability to alter the course of life, may have resorted to methods that stripped his victims of their essentials in a twisted attempt to regenerate them to his own standards. Finally, the detective collected all the pieces of the puzzle. The suspect's profile, the context of his expulsion from the scientific field, the correlation of his searches, and the meticulousness of the execution of the crimes painted a picture that could not be dismissed. Although the direct physical evidence was still insufficient for an outright indictment, the shadow of the suspect loomed over the case with inescapable force. William Hayes became in that instant a central figure in the file, a presence that, despite his apparent absence at the crime scene, was felt through every incision, every perfect cut, every organ extracted with almost ritual precision. For Mercer, what was at stake was not only the lives of the victims, but the threshold between the science that saves and the science that destroys. And at that threshold, where ambition becomes obsession, the name of William Hayes resonated as a haunting reminder that the pursuit of perfection can sometimes take its toll. One more name emerged among the reports, at first as a mere coincidence, then as an obscure trace that connected to too many lines in the case. It was not a name mentioned in calls, nor did it appear among the victims' networks, but to Detective Julian Mercer its appearance was like a shadow that shouldn't be there, and yet it persisted. Evelyn Martin, 34 years old, emergency room nurse, a professional with years of experience, indisputable clinical skills, and a shaky track record. She had been through at least 5 hospitals in less than a decade. Some reports spoke of her as effective, efficient, controlled. Others, more confidential, described erratic, disinterested, sometimes emotionally disconnected behavior. She was fired for mishandling medications, investigated for theft of medical supplies, and on a couple of occasions, informally accused of selling drugs without a license. She was never prosecuted, but her reputation slowly fragmented, like a healthy body that, without warning, begins to fail from the inside. However, the most revealing detail was not in his medical records or in the complaints. It was buried in his academic records. Evelyn had tried to become a doctor. He had tried more than once. She had been accepted into the pre-med program at a regional university. She spent 2 years in the system. She took exams, she attended labs, but she never made it through the final door. She failed medical school entrance exams on 3 consecutive occasions. Interviews revealed a mixture of emotional pressure and difficulty handling the theoretical aspects. She ended up abandoning the attempt and returned to nursing, not by vocation, but by discard. And there he stayed, in a close but not equal position, knowledgeable enough to understand the procedures, but without the title that would give him absolute control. For some, that would have been an adjustment. For Evelyn, it was a permanent wound. His former colleagues did not speak of violence or outbursts, but they did speak of a peculiar coldness. They said he did not flinch in critical situations, that he watched the monitors when vital signs dropped with a kind of aesthetic attention, that he showed no distress when a patient was dying, just silence. In an environment where fatigue could overwhelm, Evelyn remained constant, silent, professional, but emotionally detached. He had no direct connection to the victims in the case. He did not know Brian Kelly, Angela Parker, or Luis Garcia, but he had worked in hospitals where at least 2 of them had been seen in previous consultations months before their deaths. Not as serious patients, just routine medical visits. Evelyn never treated them personally, but she was close, too close not to be considered. And there was another detail. He knew the schedules. He knew how to move without arousing suspicion. He knew the access protocols, the ways to avoid cameras, the downtimes between shifts, the areas of the hospital where a body can cross without being searched. And most importantly, he knew how to cut without the body screaming. The forensic reports remained consistent. No incision showed errors. The extractions were clean, precise, done with the certainty of someone who not only knew the anatomy, but respected it as a work of art. His alibi was superficially valid. He claimed to have been working during the nights the crimes occurred. But the clock-in and clock-out records did not match the times of the murders. Some nights she was clocked in, but no activity was recorded. Others, her card was used to clock in, but not out. Supervisors could not confirm her actual presence, and administrative schedules did not account for her absences. In the search of his home, the agents found a number of items that were not illegal, but disturbing. A case of surgical instruments, clean, neat, shiny, empty bottles of controlled drugs, morphine, midazolam, high-level sedatives, no labels, no codes, and in his room, a wall covered with handmade drawings, human organs delicately traced, almost like religious icons, a kidney perfectly delineated, a heart floating on a dark surface, a liver opened as if it were a flower in full dissection. These were not medical illustrations, they were expressions of something deeper. No direct evidence linking her to the crimes was found, no fingerprints, no DNA, but the combination of her technical skill, her frustrated academic history, her privileged access to the healthcare system, and her personal environment full of anatomical symbols created a profile that was hard to ignore. To Mercer, Evelyn was not an impulsive killer, nor did she appear to be motivated by hatred. If he was guilty of something more dangerous, a deviant vocation. Perhaps in his mind he did not commit murder. Maybe he believed he was righting wrongs, that she operated where no one else did, that she proved in every perfect cut that she too deserved the title she never got. Mercer did not write it as a hypothesis, but he thought about it, because sometimes the worst violence is not born of the desire to kill, but from the desire to be recognized. And Evelyn Martin, she had been waiting too long, quietly, with a steady pulse, and the scalpel is ready. Perfection does not always ask for permission. In the end, it was the human body that spoke. No witnesses, no cameras, no digital traces. There were no fingerprints. There were no confessions, just organs, cut with almost reverent precision, removed with a technique that did not ask for permission, and in them the secret that had been hidden from the beginning. The case was solved after weeks of painstaking forensic analysis. The police had gone in circles. There was little visible evidence. The killer left no mistakes. Every scene was clean, every extraction perfect. But it was in the perfection itself that the silence began to break. In a second review of the removed organs, preserved in digital records by post-mortem reports, a forensic group found something strange. Microscopic but decisive, regenerated tissue, not natural tissue, not scar formation by body processes, but artificial intervention. The cells of these organs were not completely human. There were genetically altered fragments, traces of a structure that suggested engineering, something that shouldn't be there, and yet it was. That finding transformed the focus of the investigation. This was no longer a killer with medical knowledge. This was someone with access to and active use of cell regeneration technology, an experimental technique, controlled, limited only to very specific research centers. And in Chicago, at the time of the murders, only one person known to work on that blurred border between science and ethics was linked to such projects: William Hayes. For weeks, his figure had hovered around the case like a shadow difficult to catch. His alibi placed him outside the country, but without concrete records. He claimed to have been on a professional trip, but he presented no plane tickets, no hotel bills, just a vague itinerary, an alleged seminar that no one else confirmed. He had been fired from his laboratory for questionable practices. Internal documents spoke of unauthorized experiments, unapproved use of human tissue, and research hidden under fictitious names. There was hush talk of his obsession with organ cloning, of his belief that the human body could and should be improved by unconventional means. William was not seeking public notoriety, nor revenge. What he was after was darker, more technical. He wanted to prove that regeneration was possible, that organs could be dismantled, corrected, and rebuilt, but not in theories, in real bodies. And for that, he needed raw materials. The victims were not chosen for their history, nor for their link to him. They were selected for their availability, for their weakness, because of their isolation. They were people without constant vigilance, without close ties. Men and women who, in his eyes, were only organic structures that could be exploited. The pattern of the murder's kidney, heart, liver matched his past research. Each organ removed had symbolic value, but also functional. They were parts he had tried to replicate artificially in his experiments. But replicas were not enough. He needed to compare. He needed to integrate real tissue. He needed to validate his results. And for that, he decided to cut directly from the source. The laboratories where William worked contained no human remains. He had eliminated the physical evidence, But the digital information betrayed him. On his laptop, the experts found hidden files, databases with medical records, anatomical scans, and surgical simulations that exactly matched the cuts observed on the bodies. These were not generic illustrations, they were records, virtual trials, detailed preparation. Beyond the code and figures, Mercer found a folder titled with a single word: Essay. Inside, there were edited images. They were not photos of the corpses, they were recreations, renderings of lifeless bodies with organs removed, each accompanied by notes, by estimated removal times, by control parameters. There was no emotion. There was no cruelty, just science, meticulous, cold, deadly. William did not act out of hatred. He did not kill on impulse. He did it as part of a project, an experiment with no ethics committee, no oversight, no boundaries. For him, it was not a crime. It was a scientific validation. His arrest was not dramatic. He did not try to escape. He did not deny anything, but neither did he confess. He answered questions with evasions, with technicalities, with a calm that would not break. He knew he had lost, but he also knew he had done it his way, to the end. The trial was brief. The digital evidence, the falsity of his alibi, and the exact correspondence between his investigation and the characteristics of the bodies were enough to seal the conviction. He was convicted of multiple aggravated homicides, unlawful practice of medical procedures, and manipulation of clinical data without consent. He was sentenced to life imprisonment. The scientific community received the news with a mixture of horror and shame. William had been one of their own, brilliant, promising, an innovator. But at some point, knowledge separated from ethics. And in that split, ambition devoured him from within. Mercer wrote in his final report that the case did not just close a file. It closed a warning. Science without moral restraint can become its own form of murder. And William Hayes, in his quest to transcend the human body, ended up reducing it to a list of replaceable parts. The victims were not remembered for their achievements, for their stories. They were studied, cut, measured, archived. And that, Mercer thought, was the real crime, not only death, but the forgetfulness of the human.